Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about history! Or, more specifically, church history. And, more precisely, the way church history is used to vilify Christianity, even though the people who are using the church history don't actually know the history themselves and haven't studied it. Quite often, the claims of history are reducible to the same handful of examples that are used, with every once in a while a new claim showing up and taking the internet by storm. But often it's the same old, tired examples, like the Crusades, the Inquisition, and, of course, the witch trials. And there are a few more. Those, though, are the big ones, especially the Crusades and the Inquisition. With the Crusades and Inquisition being vilified by people who know nothing about the Crusades and nothing about the Inquisition. They just know that the Crusades were holy wars in which Christians killed non-Christians, presuming they killed them for the high crime of simply not being Christian. And the Inquisition is understood as some sort of court system, but we often imagine it as anyone being subject to the courts, including non-Christians, and they being massively unfair, with the verdict of guilty basically being assured, and with death being the most common, if not the only, punishment doled out. And, of course, there's the infamous witch trials, which we are told happen in the Dark Ages, otherwise known as the Middle Ages. We always seem to think of them as medieval, even though the witch trials were actually not medieval. And we think of them as unfair and unjust, but we also think of them as mainly presided over by clergy or church officials, and often trying people simply for being pagan, or being herbal healers, or midwives, and none of that is historically accurate. But we also have a variety of other incidences that frequently come up, some more popular than others, but it would be too long to cover every example, although I will be bringing up some other examples as we talk. And in fact, while not directly the same issue, there is another issue that is problematic and that overlaps considerably with history and how history is used to vilify Christians and Christianity. And that is that people don't know what words mean. A good example of that would be the word heresy, or the word heretic, which is obviously derived from heresy. People seem to treat the word heretic as simply someone the church wants to denounce, or views as villainous for some reason, or evil. And in reality, there is a specific meaning to the word heretic that is being ignored in the various historical examples that we see making the rounds. For example, the divine prophet Sam Harris Most Holy, who did speak the sacred and holy words of science, reason, and know God, did decree in his volume of sacred scriptures, for the holy religion of atheism is not a religion, called the end of faith, that Christians viewed Jews, historically, as the worst species of heretic. The purpose for him saying that was to point out how religions cannot tolerate other religions, and how religious belief inherently breeds an intolerant society. Because Christians will view as heretical any belief that is not part of their religious faith, even denouncing other Christians who don't have the proper beliefs. And the Jews were the most obviously subjected to persecution through Christian anti-Semitism, which of course culminated in the rise of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, a name that I am using here with the hopes that my video goes through. According to the divine prophet Sam Harris Most Holy, as well as the divine prophet Christopher Hitchens Most Holy, hallowed be their names, the anti-Semitism that fueled the Third Reich was inherently rooted in Christianity, and whether knowingly or not, the Nazis acted as agents of religion, for their anti-Semitism was purely of a Christian origin. Which brings us back to his statement. Christians view Jews as the worst species of heretic. The statement, even though it was made by the divine prophet Sam Harris Most Holy, is ridiculous on its face if you know anything about history or what the term heresy actually means. Jews, suffice it to say, were never viewed as heretics by Christians, much less the worst species of heretic. That's because to be a heretic is to be someone who professes to belong to a belief system, a confession, a creed, a faith, a religion, and yet hold beliefs that are heterodox as opposed to orthodox. That's what a heretic is. A heretic is someone who claims to be part of a philosophical or religious belief system, but whose beliefs do not align with orthodoxy. Their beliefs still align them, at least to some degree, with the overall belief system in general, but they do not adhere to an orthodox understanding of that faith. Given that Jews were not Christians, Christians did not view them as heretics. It really is that simple. Now, there are exceptions. If a Jew converted to Christianity and then held heterodox views, there were even some Jewish converts to Christianity, or people whose family had converted, but who were themselves ethnically Jewish, who were accused of being heretics, and perhaps even were heretics. But when the divine prophet Sam Harris Most Holy did decree in his sacred scriptures that Christians viewed the Jews as the worst species of heretic, he very clearly wasn't referring to people who were ethnically Jewish, but Christian, either because they converted or because their family had converted earlier. Rather, the divine prophet Sam Harris Most Holy, hallowed be his name, was very clearly referring to Jews who practiced Judaism. And while it is possible to be a Jew and a heretic, in order to be a heretical Jew, you would have to be someone who professes to be Jewish and to practice the Jewish faith, while holding to heterodox as opposed to orthodox views. And in this context, when I say orthodox, I'm not necessarily limiting that to what we call Orthodox Judaism. I'm being a little more general, because while there might actually be, and in fact there are, certain Orthodox Jews who use, for example, Reform Jews and other forms of more liberal Judaism as heretical, there are some who are more accepting, and again, it is an internal issue. However, to be declared a heretic as a Jew, you would have to be declared a heretic by other Jews. It is very rare for a heretic to declare himself a heretic. The heretic is usually declared a heretic by the faith community he comes from. And no one outside of that faith community generally declares the person to be an heretic. Now, they might refer to them as a heretic if their group has done so. For example, Jewish and Muslim and atheist scholars alike refer to Arius as a heretic who created Arianism, one of the most famous heresies in Christianity, when obviously atheists and Jews and Muslims don't share the Christian faith. But they do so not because they have looked at what Arius taught and have decided that he was a heretic, but because Christians have called him a heretic historically. And therein lies the point, because Arius claimed to be a Christian whilst promoting Arianism. Arianism is, of course, the belief that Jesus is a created and subordinate being to God, and while he is the most powerful being in creation and was the first creation, he is still subordinate to God and distinct from God. The orthodox position in Christianity, of course, is that God exists as a trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that these three are all co-equal and co-eternal. The idea then being that Jesus, as the Son of God, was not actually the Son of God in how we imagine a son would be. He is not a product of his Father. He has always existed. He is eternal. And as such, he is of equal power, equal dignity, and of the same essence as the Father. And I'm not going to go into detail about the Trinity and Arianism, because the video is not really about that. Rather, I'm simply using that as an example. Christians viewed Arius as a heretic. Christians viewed Montanus as a heretic. Christians viewed Valentinius as a heretic. Christians have viewed people as heretics, but the one thing they all have in common, even the Protestant reformers who were declared heretics by the Catholic Church, such as Martin Luther, who incurred excommunication, as well as John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli. They were all declared heretics by the Catholic Church. Obviously, they didn't understand themselves to be heretics and established their own separate institutions. But they were declared to be heretics by the Church. And what they have in common with Arius and Valentinius and Montanus and other historical heretics, for that matter, what they have in common with certain saints, like Saint Athanasius, who was also expelled by the local church community in Alexandria because they had embraced Arianism, ironically, is that each one still professed to be a Christian. And be it Athanasius, who was declared a heretic by his local community and the new bishop that replaced him as he had been bishop of Alexandria and deposed, be it a situation like his in which Athanasius clung to the Trinitarian doctrines and rejected Arianism whilst the locals embraced Arianism, seeing Jesus as a created subordinate being, or be it the other way around, where Arius himself was declared a heretic because he believed Jesus was a created subordinate being and rejected the doctrine of the Trinity. The one thing both of them would have in common is that they are Christians who claimed the Christian faith, who are being declared heretical by other Christians. And that is something that the Protestant reformers have in common with them. Which is okay, because certain Protestant reformers claimed the Pope was a heretic. That is why they called him Antichrist. They didn't, of course, call him the Antichrist like today's dispensationalists would. They didn't think it was the end times and all that. But The term Antichrist, another term that's often misunderstood, simply means one who stands in opposition to the Christ. But that is the point. Because I read an article on what a white Christian nationalist takeover of America would be like, or at the very least, a Christian nationalist takeover. The terms are used very synonymously. And in the article, someone brought up that, and I don't know if it was in the article itself or the comment section, but someone said that certain things, like being gay, transgender, bisexual, all of those things would be deemed heresies, and the people who engage in those lifestyles would be heretics. No, they wouldn't. I guarantee you that sex before marriage, being gay, being trans, being bisexual, being any of these things, would never be declared heretical. Not by a Christian nationalist government takeover. And there's more than one reason for that, but the reason here being, to be a heretic is not about indulging in behaviors that the church finds sinful. To be an heretic is to hold heterodox beliefs. One can be gay or transgender or bisexual and still hold orthodox faith. The same is true of being in an interracial marriage, which, according to this article, would also be banned as heretical because, of course, Christian nationalists are all racist white people. The problem with this, of course, is that it makes absolutely no sense to think of behaviors as heretical. A good example of that would be the recent excommunication of Carlo Maria Vigano, former archbishop within the Catholic Church. Many people in the media claim that he has been declared an heretic, and the idea that Vigano has been declared a heretic is even more common online in comment sections and message boards and things along those lines. Blog posts would say it. But the thing is, Vigano has not been accused of heresy, nor was he excommunicated for heresy, nor does his excommunication make him officially a heretic. Vigano was excommunicated for schism. Schism is when you refuse to obey the authority of the church, or actively defy it and work against it. And Vigano was accused of rejecting the authority of those in the church who were his superiors and setting up a rival power structure. Vigano was not accused of holding heterodox beliefs. He was accused of acting in opposition to church authorities. The way, of course, we use the word heretic is simply as a blanket condemnation of behavior we don't like. That's why that article claimed that things like sex before marriage and being gay and having an interracial marriage would be deemed heresies, when they obviously wouldn't have been. Because they think of the word heresy as simply a word that was used to condemn people the church didn't like or disapproved of for some reason, rather than having a specific definition. And you would see that people use these terms to make the historical arguments. For example, another word people don't understand is excommunication. What does it mean to be an excommunicated person? Well, there's actually a word for excommunicated people. It's called excommunicate. And I don't mean excommunicate as in I am going to excommunicate you. I mean I am an excommunicant. The term excommunicant, or excommunication, is often taken to mean you are just damned to hell. It means that you are shunned I've even heard people claim that excommunication is a form of shunning. People who are excommunicated are cut off from family and friends. People who are excommunicated cannot be spoken to. The church officially teaches that if you are excommunicated, no one is allowed to talk to you. And of course, this is used to criticize Christians because they excommunicate you. They practice shunning, just like the Amish, who are also Christian, but this is an extreme form of shunning. Some even think it's a worse form. The strange part about it is, excommunication is not a form of shunning. Excommunication means that you have been denied communion. It's actually in the word, communication. Communion. An excommunicated person is denied communion. Which may not seem like much if you're not a Christian, or specifically a Christian of a sacramental church, like the Catholic Church. But if you believe that the sacraments are efficacious and carry the very essence of Christ somehow, be it in transubstantial form or consubstantial form, if you believe that taking the sacraments is what can bestow grace upon you and bring you closer to Christ, then being denied communion is a devastating blow. However, people are allowed to talk to people who have been excommunicated within Catholicism. It is not a form of shunning. Indeed, you're encouraged to talk to people who are excommunicated, specifically with the hopes of getting them to renounce whatever sin it was that incurred excommunication. Because there is one sacrament that you can avail yourself to if excommunicated. Because excommunication, even though it's in the very word that you're being withheld communion, which is the most common sacrament people partake of, they do it repeatedly. But you are also denied matrimony and other sacraments, but let's face it, most of them wouldn't apply anymore. If you're a Catholic of a certain age, old enough to be excommunicated, you're probably also already been confirmed. You have already been baptized. So, certain sacraments being withheld to you wouldn't matter much, because either you've already taken them and they're a one-and-done deal, or if you don't care about the church, they wouldn't matter. Of course, if you did care, then it would. But there is one sacrament that is open to you. You can avail to this one sacrament. It is the only sacrament in the church that you can appeal to if you are excommunicate. And that is confession. Because if you confess your sin, and show contrition, and are willing to do penance, the excommunication would be lifted, and you would be brought back into communion. Excommunication is not shunning the person, it is simply withholding the sacraments from them. At the same time, I've heard some people tell me that excommunication is damning the person to hell, at least according to Catholic belief, because you are denied all sacraments, even confession, and therefore you can never, ever be forgiven. And that's not true either. And there are other historical myths, some of which have to do with the sacraments. For example, I typed in a history for the sacrament of marriage, and the AI that is now becoming ubiquitous on search engines for Yahoo informed me that marriage was not considered a sacrament within the Catholic Church until 1563 at the Council of Trent. This is nonsense. Marriage had been a sacrament within the Church from the earliest days. It is mentioned as a sacrament by Grattini in his Codes of Canon Law, which were well before Trent, or Peter Lombard. And what's more, this one has another problem with another historical myth that was quoted again by the divine prophet Sam Harris Most Holy in his work of sacred scripture for the holy religion of atheism, which I remind you is not saying atheism is a religion. When I use the term the holy religion of atheism, I'm talking about the organized secular movement that simply hides behind the term to avoid criticism. I'm still going to be accused of saying atheism is a religion anyway, but I still wanted to put this in there. Nevertheless, the divine prophet Sam Harris Most Holy made a similar statement about marriage in regards to transubstantiation, claiming that at the Fourth Lateran Council, the date of which he got wrong, by the way, was when the doctrine of transubstantiation came into existence, that before the council, no one believed in transubstantiation. After the council, everyone did. And of course, people believed him. Especially back in the heyday of the new atheism, I would run into that particular claim. Not as often as some of the others, but regularly. And it makes no sense. And it makes no sense for the same reason that saying marriage was not added to the sacraments until the Council of Trent. Doesn't make sense. Because, you see, if that were true, then you would have to explain the Eastern Orthodox churches, which, while they don't use the term sacrament, they use the term mystery, nevertheless have 7 mysteries, including matrimony, and affirm the truth of transubstantiation within the Eucharist. The Great Schism that separated the Eastern churches from the Western churches happened in 1054 AD. The church, which had been one, was now 2. And after the schism, there were mutual excommunications on both sides. And the Eastern Orthodox churches simply were not bound by the teachings of the Catholic Church if they were to develop anything new. According to this timeline, though, we're stuck with a problem. Because, you see, if the Great Schism that separated the Eastern churches from the Western churches occurred in 1054 AD, and the Fourth Lateran Council occurred in 1215 AD, then why would the Eastern Orthodox churches also teach transubstantiation? Keep in mind, the divine prophet Sam Harris Most Holy, hallowed be his name, hallowed be the name of science, hallowed be the name of reason, hallowed be the name of no God, did decree that before the Fourth Lateran Council, no one believed in transubstantiation. After the Fourth Lateran Council, everyone did. That the Fourth Lateran Council was where the doctrine of transubstantiation was invented. That the council just made it up. And that prior to this point, no one believed in it. And yet we know that today the Eastern Orthodox churches do believe in transubstantiation. Did the Eastern Orthodox churches comply with the Fourth Lateran Council, which they had no representation in, since after the schism they didn't recognize the councils? Did they recognize the authority of the Fourth Lateran Council, even though they weren't there? Or better yet, maybe they did send representation. Maybe even though there was a schism and mutual excommunications, they sent representatives there. Or maybe they didn't, but they simply obeyed the Pope, because he's the head of the church. Even though the whole point behind the schism was a denial that the Pope had universal authority and jurisdiction, they obeyed him anyway after he told them they had to believe in transubstantiation. Perhaps they were won over by the theological arguments and adopted them in, or perhaps they developed the theological arguments on their own independently, but it does seem a little suspicious that both the East and the West embrace the doctrine of transubstantiation of the Eucharist, while at the same time the doctrine of transubstantiation was invented in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council after the Great Schism. Likewise, since marriage was not added to the list of sacraments until the Council of Trent in 1563, we wouldn't expect the Eastern Orthodox churches to list it as a sacrament. The Orthodox churches should have 6 sacraments at the very most, because marriage is not a sacrament within Eastern Orthodoxy, and yet marriage is a sacrament in Eastern Orthodoxy. They call it mystery instead of sacrament, but it means the same thing. They are of the same belief that the Catholics are. They believe that there are 7 mysteries, or 7 mysterions, and they adhere to the idea that holy matrimony is a mysterion, it's a mystery, it's a sacrament. And that's sort of the problem. Because you see a lot of resources that tell you that marriage only became a sacrament in 1563. And they will even tell you that the Protestants rejected this addition by the Council of Trent, such as in the 39 Articles of Religion. They specifically rejected marriage as a sacrament in Article 25. And that's true, but misleading. You see, Article 25 of the 39 Articles of Religion does not say, marriage is not a sacrament like the Council of Trent says, or something along those lines. Rather, it says there are only 2 sacraments: baptism and the Lord's Supper, or communion. It does list the remaining 5 that are called sacraments. This includes marriage, but also includes confirmation, or ordination to holy orders, or confession. To the Anglicans embracing the 39 Articles of Religion for the Church of England, there were to be only 2 sacraments, and the other 5 so-called sacraments were not sacraments. That's not to say they were abolished in any way or seen as completely worthless. Anglicans, for instance, claim that they have apostolic succession just like Catholics, and while the Catholic Church rejects Anglican holy orders as valid, within the Anglican communion, Anglican holy orders are understood to be the same as Catholic holy orders. They are based on the same theological concepts of apostolic succession and transmission. But in spite of this, they do not understand ordination to the diaconate, the priesthood, or the bishopric to be sacramental. And that goes back to Protestant theology, where they are basing all of their beliefs on the Bible alone as the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice, and in which they would need to have biblical warrant for such a claim. There is also the fact that they had a theological basis for rejecting the other 5. That being said, that they looked at the 2 sacraments that they claimed were sacraments, communion and baptism, as rituals by which would confer grace. They were not mere badges or tokens, as the article says. Those who claim that the 25th article in the 39 Articles of Religion deny marriage as a sacrament tend to imply to the reader that the 25th article in the 39 Articles of Religion is specifically targeting the Council of Trent adding the marriage to the list of sacraments, when in reality it had nothing to do with the Council of Trent at all. It had to do with the fact that Protestants of the time within the Church of England saw neither scriptural warrant for calling these things sacraments, nor did they understand them as conferring grace in the same way the other two did. They did not condemn them or deny them. They actually still performed all of them. They simply didn't think of them as conferring grace upon you, in the same way a sacrament would. Which is another thing that I've noticed about the misreporting of marriage as a sacrament. They often act as if, when the Church declared marriage a sacrament at the Council of Trent in 1563, that is when the Church got involved in marriage and you needed a priest to perform the marriage. Prior to that, marriage was simply a civil ceremony and had no connection to the Church. This is of course ridiculous, since people were getting married in churches well before the Council of Trent or before the Protestant Reformation. And while some people might defend that by saying they were married in church, but it was still a civil ceremony and not a sacrament, they seem to ignore the fact that, again, it was called a sacrament by Peter of Lombard and by Gratinian, by several others, well prior to the Protestant Reformation, well prior to the Council of Trent. But you see these arguments coming up quite often, just like you see the idea that you can blame all Christians for historical actions of the few cropping up. Never mind the fact that it's unfair to blame modern living people who had nothing to do with the historical event, and blame them for it because they simply share the same religious beliefs as those who committed the atrocities. The simple fact of the matter is, they will quite often blame all Christians for what other Christians didn't do, and in fact, it is not uncommon for people to blame all Christians on things that actually hurt Christians. For example, it's popular to argue the Ku Klux Klan was a Christian organization that claimed to be Christian in order to shame Christians and to point out the great evil in their religion and in their history. But if I point out to people that various churches condemned the Ku Klux Klan, even back when it was originally founded, the second Klan being founded sometime in the early 20th century, after Birth of a Nation was released in theaters in 1915. What I get is told this. So what? They act like it's not important that these churches condemned the Ku Klux Klan. After all, the Klan claimed to be Christian, and that's all that matters. But does it? You're literally saying people who condemned the Ku Klux Klan from day one are nevertheless guilty of creating the Ku Klux Klan and should hang their head in shame at the history of their religion because their faith gave us the Ku Klux Klan and it's their fault. It becomes even more ridiculous when you realize that the Ku Klux Klan actively targeted certain churches. And I don't just mean black churches, because that would make sense given their racist nature of the organization. Targeting black churches is less targeting churches and more targeting blacks. But they didn't just target black churches, they also targeted the Catholic Church. And the Ku Klux Klan had a unique, specific hatred of Catholics. Indeed, if you look at Ku Klux Klan materials from the 1920s onward, you will find a decidedly anti-Catholic bend to a lot of their materials. Catholics, along with certain other groups, like the blacks, should be disenfranchised, and certain people, like foreigners and Catholics, should be forced out of America, exiled away from civilized society, ruled by the white man. The Catholic Church didn't just face rhetorical attacks by the Ku Klux Klan, There were physical assaults, arson attacks on churches, even murders. And by murders, I sometimes mean lynchings of Catholics by the Ku Klux Klan. But I point this out, and I'm told that Christians have a long history of fighting and even killing other Christians. Therefore, you haven't proven anything. They act as if my argument is, the Ku Klux Klan is not Christian because they attacked other Christians. When in reality, even if I accept that the Ku Klux Klan was a Christian organization, for the sake of argument, don't deny it, it was definitely Christian and definitely based on the Christian religion, definitely all about the Christian faith. It is still preposterous to then blame all Christians for the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, as if all Christians have exactly the same beliefs because they all love Jesus, and it is ridiculous to think that Catholics, who were the victims of the Ku Klux Klan, are guilty of creating the Ku Klux Klan. And saying that Christians have a long history of fighting and killing Christians for having the wrong beliefs doesn't justify saying that Catholics are why the Ku Klux Klan existed, simply because they're Christian and they're part of the same religion, and thus their hate-based religion gave rise to the Klan. It's silly when you think about it. It's silly to think churches that actively oppose the Ku Klux Klan, like the Churches of Christ, or various different Baptist or Methodist groups that oppose them, or Anglicans. Instead, we just lump them all together. Perhaps more understandably, but also incorrectly, we lump them also in with other hate groups like the Westboro Baptist Church, which famously says God hates fags, and famously protested funerals for soldiers, saying, thank God a soldier is dead. And yet they're not natural allies like people imagine, because even though they're both considered hate groups, they both have fundamentally different reasons for their hatred. For example, the Westboro Baptist Church firmly opposes racism, and its founder, Fred Phelps, actually marched in the civil rights parades and marched into Selma with Martin Luther King. And I don't know if it's a literal marching into Selma or figurative. I don't remember the exact details, but Phelps was a civil rights activist, and he did get arrested along with several of King's men. Interesting history indeed. But therein lies another problem with discussing history and Christianity. People don't seem to want to have a complex understanding of the history. They want a simple, not complex history. One lacking in any sort of nuance, and in which terms and words and meanings don't actually exist. But therein lies the problem. Because these churches don't all have the same beliefs. They don't all have the same theology. And yet we act as if they do. It's rather like the modern people turning to history to show the evils of a potential Christian theocracy in America by pointing to the Dark Ages when religion ruled and it was oppressive and cruel. Science was outlawed and women had no rights, and racism was rampant, and no freedoms existed. And the same would happen if the white Christian nationalists take over. It would be just like in the Dark Ages. And of course, they also present us with a narrative where the white Christian nationalists, the evangelical Protestants in America, would somehow set up a system like in the Middle Ages, which makes no sense when you think about it. And in fact, one of the fears of this Christian takeover would be that, just like in the Dark Ages, we would have several wars over religion, because even though these churches are allies now against the secular government, which gives us freedom and democracy that they hate, and that they wish to replace with a theocracy for only Christians have rights, or Christian men have rights, or white Christian men have rights, if they were to ever overthrow the secular government, their alliance would collapse, since each one of them would want their specific denomination to be the one church in charge, believing all others to be heretics. And thus wars of religion would break out, like in Bosnia, and America would be broken up. And we know that because that's what it was like in the Dark Ages with wars of religion. Of course, the wars of religion happened in Europe during the Protestant Reformation. And there was more involved in the wars of religion than simply disagreeing on theological issues. There were actually issues involving law and the establishments of the monarchies and the establishments of the rights of the people, because even though we take for granted that there's this thing called religion, and some people are religious and other people are not, and that there's this clear understanding of what religion is, even if we don't fully understand what religion is in terms of being able to define it clearly, we do know it should be separate from government, and in fact is separate from government as a category. It can be mixed with government in the world, but it is a distinct thing from philosophy, from science, from politics. And we assume that's how it's always been in human history, and it simply wasn't. The wars of religion in Europe, while I can't go into the details of them in this video because it's already long and I have to wrap it up at this point, were not simply fought because people disagreed over private religious beliefs about the nature of God or the nature of salvation, but rather on the implications of the theology and how the authority of the church and state actually functioned. The Protestant Reformation would be the equivalent of if a popular movement developed in America that decided the Constitution and constitutional principles on which it is based are garbage and we shouldn't follow them. A movement which may have some people saying already exists in the form of Christian nationalism, but in reality, if you listen to the Christian nationalists, they're nothing like how they're described. For example, David Barton, while obviously not a credible historian, doesn't really want people who are not Christian to be stripped of their rights, and doesn't actually want the Christian church to run the government. If you actually listen to him, he veritably worships America's founding fathers, and whether you agree with what he's saying or not about their views, he very obviously thinks that freedom of religion should be continued. The truth is, if people like David Barton, or Rick Santorum, or Mike Huckabee took over, you would not have them trying to make the Christian church in charge of the government, where clergy run everything. And you certainly wouldn't have fights breaking out between them because they want their denomination to take over. Rather, they want religious freedom for the various theological disagreements, and simply want people who broadly hold their idea of Christian morals and ethics and standards to be elected into a Republican form of government to uphold those values. So they really just want to elect politicians who would effect certain political changes. They don't actually want the church in charge of everything. And really, the Middle Ages were not the oppressive tyranny that people imagined them to have been. They were not the Dark Ages. They were not 1,000 years of stagnation with no progress. What's more, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was not the authoritarian power that people imagine it to be. Neither was it an all-powerful institution that could get what it wanted. In fact, armies marched against the Catholic Church in Christian Europe. The Church was often ignored on certain issues. At one point, the Pope was actually kidnapped and forced to be in France. This was called the Babylonian exile of the Pope. It was also called the Avignon Popes. And it led to a series of anti-popes existing, where two popes basically existed in Europe. Really, only one of them was the Pope. The other was considered an anti-pope. But they were still declared Pope at one point, and ruled from the papal palace in Avignon, in France. The political structure in medieval Europe was more complicated than people give it credit for. What's more, while it is true that the Catholic Church held tremendously more political influence than churches do typically today, you can't just look at the way the Catholic Church integrated into the state in the Middle Ages and assumed modern-day evangelical Protestants would want the same thing, or that it would have the same results. You see, one of the lessons that we should learn from the wars of religion, but that we don't, is that these wars are not simply fought over whether or not God is a Trinity, or whether or not transubstantiation happens, or whether or not we're saved by faith alone, or if we are saved by cooperative grace, in which we actively seek to obey God's will, which is often reduced to the simplistic narrative in today's world as saved by faith alone or by faith plus works, which isn't really the issue, but it is the issue in people's minds. It would be utterly foreign to modern-day evangelical Protestants to want the Christian Church to rule the government like it did in the Dark Ages. Because, in addition to not being an accurate view of how the Middle Ages worked, the reason the Catholic Church exercised any sort of political power at all within the temporal sphere was because of the theological beliefs they had about the Church. Theological beliefs that are very different than the Protestants. And I don't just mean different in that they think the Catholic Church is the one true church and not the specific Protestant denominations or even Protestant churches in general. Rather, the Catholic Church teaches that the Church itself is the kingdom of Christ on earth. As such, the Church has laws, the Church has courts, the Church has government officials, secretaries of state. The Church has nuncios, which are basically ambassadors. The Catholic Church runs like a government, not simply because they run the Vatican City State, an independent country, but because that is inherently how they understand the Church. Even if they lost the Vatican City State, even if they were forced into a situation where no country in the world recognized them as such, they would have to continue to operate as an institution as having a political aspect to them, because the kingdom of Christ is the Church on earth now. And it is the exercise of the authority of Christ that is the business of the Church, as it opens relations with other governments, as it advises its rulers, especially its Christian rulers, and as it informs the laws. And while there are Protestant churches that also believe this, notably Anglicans and Lutherans, when we talk about evangelical Protestants, the ones that they most fear, wish to bring about the Christian nationalist takeover, like, well, Mike Huckabee or David Barton, or, for whatever reason, Rick Santorum, you don't really have the same beliefs. Santorum, I believe, is actually Mormon, but the others that they typically list are Baptist or evangelical. And the Baptists and evangelicals, while they don't agree with everything on all points, don't actually understand the Church to be the kingdom of Christ on earth. Rather, the actual Christian Church is not even their specific denomination. Rather, they have this concept called the institutional church. And institutional churches are necessary since they organize worship services, organize educational outreach programs, organize charitable events, and, in general, facilitate the things that the church should be doing, like visiting the sick, or running poverty relief programs. But the institutional church is not the church. The real church is actually the invisible body of all believers. They think that the church is therefore mystical and transcendent, and is not limited to a specific denomination. That's why saying that these churches believe that their denomination is the one true church, and they view others as heretics and would want rid of them and would want their church to be in charge, is rather silly, because they don't actually think that, and they're much more willing to cooperate. And if you think that they shouldn't be able to, since denominations clearly would have radically different teachings so they'd be the same church, well, you're not really accurate. two churches can be different denominations and have exactly the same beliefs. It's not really true that the only reason we have new churches is because of church splits over disagreement on how to interpret the Bible or over theological differences. And it really isn't true that of the 64,000 denominations that exist and counting, that each one is unique and different and totally unrelated, because each one is the result of a church split and thus bringing greater confusion to the Christian world. It isn't even true that all institutional churches, as they would be called for this particular purpose, are founded by splitting off of another church. Some of them are just directly founded and didn't actually start as part of another church. And some people will say that they actually were, because they would have been founded by people who were Christian, and those people would have belonged to a denomination, and if they were happy in their denomination, they wouldn't have left it to found their own church. So that still counts as a church split, because they disagreed with what their church was teaching and founded their own. Which, of course, assumes the only reason a new church would be founded is because people were dissatisfied in their existing church and left it. In reality, many new churches are founded simply because someone wants to be a pastor. Or because a group of people want to meet and eventually form a church. Not all churches are founded by people who leave a denomination because they disagree with its teachings, or else formally over a split, as disagreement on the theology causes the structures to split, and some congregations denounce the other one. Rather, sometimes the new churches are simply created because someone wanted to start a church in a local town, and that's it. In fact, most of the new denominations that come into existence precisely that way, and consist of one or maybe two or three at most actual congregations. Most of them are local, and most of them die out within 30 or 40 years, only to have new ones founded in their place. And that's because the evangelicals don't actually view denominational affiliation as all that important. And they don't really have a rigid sense of orthodoxy. And it's very rare to hear them use the word heretic and heresy. They're much more generalized, which isn't to say that specific teachings can't be found in specific denominations of evangelical Protestants, or that their specific teachings might disagree with another one. However, you will find that the majority of the time where there is disagreement, there is also mutual respect and understanding, and they will often see the other as truly saved Christians, believing in the adage that we should have unity in the essentials, liberty in the unessentials, and in all things love. Evangelicals largely reduce what is necessary to be a truly saved Christian teaching properly to a handful of things, and while there is some disagreement even on what the essentials are, for the most part, there is a generally agreed upon concept of being saved by faith alone, through grace alone, in Christ alone, believing the Bible is the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice, and is utterly infallible and without error in terms of doctrine, at least in the original manuscripts, that one, if one is evangelical, has that moment of salvation to which one goes from an unsaved sinner to a saved state by praying to invite Jesus into their heart and having a profound conversion experience, and so on. The truth of the matter is, evangelical theology is not really as generalized and as confusing as people say. And while there are disagreements between churches, and there are some churches that split over disagreements, most of the time the disagreements are minor and few, and the churches have a broad, similar core of teachings that they all agree on, which allow them to freely travel between one church and another. Most evangelicals are not particularly bound to one denomination and don't really think of their church as the one true church. Because, again, they think the true church is an invisible body of all believers, and the institutional church is simply there to facilitate certain functions. And most evangelicals also embrace a form of millenarianism, with most of them these days, in America at least, embracing dispensationalism. Famously, this is the origin of the rapture of the church, where toward the end times, or perhaps in the middle of the Great Tribulation, or after the Great Tribulation, the Christian believers will be raptured to heaven, where they will be spared the final battle and awful consequences at Armageddon. With the most popular form of that, especially since Left Behind, being the pre-tribulation rapture, where there will be 7 years of tribulation. But before it begins, the Christians will experience the rapture and meet Jesus in the sky and then leave for 7 years. And at the end of the 7 years, that final battle at Armageddon and the return of Christ in glory to establish his kingdom on earth. And therein lies the great distinction, because evangelicals do not think the church is the kingdom of Christ on earth. Evangelicals believe the kingdom will be established in the future, whilst Catholics believe the kingdom has already been established on earth. It is the church. Generally speaking, evangelical Protestants, especially in America, don't view the church as a political body and don't view the church as the kingdom of Christ. And while it may be true that they think the church should speak on certain cultural and political issues as pertaining to their moral teachings, they don't think that the denomination they belong to is the one true church, and they don't just unite out of convenience to overthrow the secular government, only to turn on each other, because that wouldn't make sense. They don't want their church to be in charge of the government. That wouldn't make sense either. It wouldn't even make sense for the Catholic Church to do that, since the Catholic Church in history did not take over and directly rule countries, but rather advise the kings of those countries, working in something that is called the Symphony of State by the Eastern Orthodox, where they worked in harmony with the secular temporal rulers, rather than dominating them. The evangelicals, on the other hand, would simply keep the constitutional republic as it is. We would have a Congress made up of 2 parts, the House of Representatives and the Senate. We would have a president who serves 4-year terms, probably limited to 2, and we would simply elect them. Their goal is not to overthrow the secular government and create a theocracy like the real-life Handmaid's Tale, like a theocracy like Iran and Saudi Arabia under Christian Sharia law. Their goal is simply to elect conservative Christians to Congress to pass laws that are morally in line with their beliefs and their teachings. They don't want to outlaw all religions besides Christianity. They generally aren't racist against people. They don't want to strip women of their rights. In fact, they support many women candidates, like Taylor, Marjorie Greene Taylor, who get support. They simply want candidates elected to office that reflect their values, but believe that there should be a constitutional republic. And they don't want to outlaw anything. They simply want things like prayer back in schools. It really wouldn't be as awful as people say if they got everything they wanted. And you really can't compare them to the so-called Dark Ages, because not only were the Dark Ages a mythology that perverts the actual Middle Ages, and ignores all the advantages that were developed within the Middle Ages, and its actual history, which, while not all good, is not the oppressive tyranny that we're often told it was. But their beliefs are so fundamentally different than a medieval Catholic's that it wouldn't make sense for them to want this sort of thing. And yet we think it does. And we do the same thing with several other issues, like the Crusades, which most people know were evil and bad and atrocities that can't be justified. But when pressed to tell us what they are, they either don't know or have some vague answer about killing people for not being Christian or trying to force them to convert, giving them a choice of convert or die. When in reality, the Crusades were largely defensive, because Christians had lost 2/3 of Christian lands to Islamic expansionism, and because they wished to protect Europe, and they wished to protect pilgrims going to the Holy Land, Christian pilgrims. The Inquisition was not the horrible horrible trial system where it was rigged, thinking you were guilty already, and where everyone was put to death. Most of the time, the death penalty wasn't given at all, and the truth is, the Inquisition never gave the death penalty. If you received the death penalty, it would be by the state deciding your sentence for the Inquisition. Even then, you could only get the death penalty as a repeated or particularly egregious offender. And the trial systems of the Inquisition were actually seen as more fair, with punishments being more lenient than the civil courts of their day. The Inquisition, of course, could only try Christians because, again, the Inquisitional court was there to root out heresies. The Inquisitional courts were not there to try people for doing things just because the church didn't like them. And the Inquisitional court could not try Jews or Muslims. Most of the fake history on that stems from the conversios. The conversios being, of course, either people who were Jewish who converted to Catholicism, or people who were ethnically Jewish whose ancestors had converted to Catholicism. And it is true that they put conversos on trial. It is true that in Spain especially, because a lot of this comments about the Inquisition actually only come from the Spanish Inquisition, which itself was not really part of the regular Inquisition, but was established by the Spanish monarchy for its own purposes, and was itself condemned by the Pope. But nevertheless, we see it as all just the Inquisition. And it is true that conversios, the Jewish converts to Catholicism, were particularly well trusted in Spain, but that is owing more to the unique history of the situation. And before I say this, I already know some of you are going to say, "Oh, so that makes it okay." Keep in mind, I'm discussing the history. I am not saying it makes it okay. At the same time, it's not the same as people say it was. You see, most people seem to think of Spain as Catholic, and having always been Catholic, and it was Catholic in the Dark Ages. In reality, for 800 years it was Islamic, because Iberia had been conquered by Muslims. In fact, they almost took France, except for Charles at the Battle of Tours, routing them, stopping them from further encroaching into Europe. At the Battle of Tours. But Spain, for 800 years, had been Islamic. And then there was a Reconquista, where Christian rulers and Christian peoples took back the lands that had been taken by the Muslims 800 years prior. And it was during this time that very strict laws were passed, and only Christians could be in Spain. Since this was still the 1400s, there really was no concept of the Protestant Reformation yet. It was coming very soon, but it hadn't happened yet. But it was during this time that all Muslims and all Jews were to be expelled from Hispania, or from all of Iberia. However, this was not a race-based policy. This was a confession-based. And I say confession-based because they didn't have the concept of religion we did today. Yes, they worshipped gods, but they didn't understand religion the same way we do, but that's for another video. The point here being, if you were Catholic, you could stay. While many Jews chose to leave, others chose to stay in Spain and converted to Catholicism. The reason this caused distrust was not because they believed that Jewish blood made you incapable of truly converting to Christ, or they held this deep-seated anti-Semitism saying that all Jews are Christ killers, just by nature they're evil. Rather, many of them suspected that the Jewish converts only converted so they could stay in Spain. And to be fair, this fear was actually to some degree warranted, because there were fake conversions. There were people who outwardly converted to Catholicism, but who secretly continued to practice Judaism. That's not to say all of the conversios did. Many of the conversios were actually genuine converts to Catholicism, or at the very least, lived a Catholic life and had children and grandchildren who were enculturated as Catholics rather than Jews. However, there were some Jews who continued to secretly practice Judaism, and even passed on this secret practice of Judaism to their children and their grandchildren, so that they were outwardly Catholic, but secretly still practicing the Jewish faith. And again, I'm not saying what the Spanish government did was right. I'm not saying it makes it okay. But at the same time, people who claim that Christians were racist and anti-Semitic and thought that Jews could not convert to Christianity, that's not really true. They understood that Jews could convert to Christianity. But many in Spain questioned the sincerity of these conversions because the law said you had to be Catholic to stay in Spain, or really you had to be Christian. They didn't really have the Protestant Reformation yet, so they hadn't yet developed any sort of distinctions between them. There were actually different Christian groups besides the Catholic Church in Europe at the time, but they were largely marginalized, especially in Spain. And again, the point isn't to say, that makes it okay. The point is simply to say that the reason for the distrust of the conversios was precisely because you could never tell if they genuinely converted to Catholicism or if they were secretly remaining Jewish. Because if you converted only because of the law saying so, and your other choice was to be exiled from your home, it was understood that many people would choose to convert, but not really convert. And again, there were plenty of Jews who didn't really convert. Some of them were actually guilty of secretly not practicing the Catholic faith and secretly continuing to practice the Jewish faith. Again, I'm not saying that because I think it's okay to ban people based on not being Christian. But there is a historical myth that says that they hated Jews as Christ killers and didn't think they could convert based on race, which doesn't exist. And many of these historical myths are often bundled up with how we use words or how we don't know what the words mean. It's bundled up with our understanding of modern politics and modern culture, our understanding of a world that has nation-states and a clear concept of religion as a personally held belief system that has a communal aspect, but is still a voluntary choice of believing certain things, and our understanding of race and racism being projected onto a past where they don't belong, and where we don't even bother learning the details. I doubt most people who are making these claims could even tell us who the King of France was in 1450, or what the laws concerning religious devotion were in the 1560s in England. Most of them couldn't tell you how the Inquisitional Court actually functioned, how it held its trials, or how many orders of knights fought in the First Crusade, or any of that. They don't know. They don't know the details. They don't know the facts. All they know is that the people who did these things committed atrocities, and they were Christian, and they did them in the name of Christianity, and Christians today are guilty. And of course, that's as ridiculous as thinking Muslims today are all terrorists because of 9/11. It's ridiculous, it's absurd, but people do it. I haven't much else to say, so I shall take my leave of you. Thank you. God bless, and goodbye.